Let me now introduce our second speaker, Mr. Wilson Erumebor. Mr. Erumebor is a senior economist at the Nigerian Economic Summit Group, Nigeria's foremost private sector-led think tank. Wilson's area of expertise include macroeconomic policies, trade, structural transformation, and inclusive growth of African economy. Wilson has delivered presentations on African economies and African Continental Free Trade Area agreement to boards and management of organizations across Africa. Wilson, the floor is yours, and you have 15 minutes to cover your points. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. I'll say thank you to Trends Research for putting this together. I think this is my second time, and it's always a pleasure to be here. Also, thank you, Excellency Dr. Omar, for the interesting presentation, and especially how you highlighted some of the historical relations, because of course that is also important, and especially also the regional, proximity between Africa and the GCC countries. So pretty much, I think you've covered some of the aspects that I intend to cover. So in some instances, I'll have to move a bit faster if you've elaborated on those points. And so the structure of the presentation would basically dwell more on investment and trade between Africa and GCC, and I will talk a bit more about the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, and also on the sectors that are available for investment and partnership between both countries, both regions. Yeah, so this is basically just showing the fact that the market size of both Africa and the GCC. Africa has 54 countries, and in total GDP of Africa is about 2.68 trillion. This is an estimate from the IMF. If you look at the World Bank, you'd see different GDP figures. Also, the GCC, you have 1.6 trillion dollars size. So that tells you that collectively, both economies were looking at a 4.36 trillion market size, and that's quite huge, and it tells you that there are lots of potentials and trade and investment that can happen between both regions. Now, looking at the growth pattern of these countries, we've seen perhaps a recovery from the COVID-19. The yellow bar, which represents 2020, basically looks at the recession that many countries fell into as a result of the COVID-19. But more interestingly, and particularly in the Africa part, which is on the right, you'd see that growth in 2021 is expected to recover even much higher than what we recorded between 2015 to 2019 average. So which tells you that these economies are recovering as we begin to open up to investment and trade. Some of this growth may be due to the base effect, but then it still also tells you that there's lots of changes going on, especially in terms of the services sector driving some of these growth that we see. And also commodity price will also have a role to play, especially because oil prices are really, really high at the moment. And for commodity dependent countries, we expect to see some more improved performance, even much higher than what we've had before COVID. Now, moving on to trade, between Africa and the GCC. I think Dr. Omar, highlighted some of these points, but one key point to note here is that if you look at the trade, you realize that it's still below 10%, either in terms of export and import. So you would see that much of Africa, we imported, close to 35 billion worth of goods, from the GCC. And if you do that at the share of total imports, with the rest of the world, you would see that it's just at 7% in 2020. Same Africa exports to GCC, you'd see it's 8% of total exports to the rest of the world, which, points to the fact that, yes, we're coming from a low base. If you look at 2018, it moved from 4%, in 2019, 5%, and to 8%, which is something, perhaps very good and worth noting, but it's still very low, especially when you compare with, trade partners like China. So I think what this tells you is that there's still room for even more growth. The same thing is also with the GCC. Exports to Africa is about 5% of their total export to the rest of the world, and import is about 9%. So the basic point here is that there's room for even more growth. When we also look at the composition, what exactly do the top 5 products that that are traded between Africa and the GCC? You'd realize that for Africa, much of what we import from the GCC are mineral products, oil and oil-related products, which accounts for about 47% of total imports from the GCC. We also have other products, plastics, vehicles, electrical, machineries, tobacco and other manufactured substitutes. In terms of what Africa exports to the GCC, pretty much, our precious, metals, precious stones, basically gold and diamond, account for a significant share of that. And some of these precious stones, metals account for, 73% of exports to GCC. And, Dr. Omar mentioned in terms of investments, a lot of the investments that are coming from the GCC, is from the UAE, which accounts for, about 88%. And this also tells you the need for diversity. GCC has 6 countries, and if 88%, and then you also, if you include Saudi Arabia, that's almost 100%, tells you that, the other countries perhaps need to also get involved. Maybe sort of like the GCC itself needs to perhaps come together and do some mobilization, in terms of investment, because the opportunities are so enormous in the continent. Now, just briefly, some of the, if the similarities between Africa and GCC. Thankfully, Dr. Omar mentioned the historical connections between both regions. I also think one point to note is the fact that both regions rely a lot on commodities. Crude oil, mineral products, account for a significant share of government revenue, foreign exchange and export earnings, between both regions. If you also look at the structure of the economy, you would realize that there's been some transition from movement of labor and economic activities towards the services sector, and this is particular to many African countries and even some GCC countries. So what we've seen is the fact that manufacturing has not been doing pretty much well, and hence that's why you see GCC and African countries are also trying to pursue economic diversification to boost, manufacturing sector and its share in GDP and employment. Also, many of these countries have very low tax to GDP ratio, which basically means most of the revenue still comes from crude oil. And also, this basically points to the fact that a lot of activities, we need to boost private sector investment and also see how we can raise revenues from those activities. And the historic, religious and language links are also very, very important, especially with some of the African countries, particularly the East African countries, and even in some of the West African countries as well. Just briefly, some differences would, oil still account for a significant share of some of the economies. Some countries rely heavily on crude oil, but in the case of some African countries, you also have cases where they are not commodity dependent. The likes of Rwanda and co. So commodities does so, which basically tells the point that Africa is also diverse. we have 54 countries. So some are resource rich, some are not. GCC countries also, they have larger savings, external reserves, sovereign wealth funds, and all of that. And I think that's one key area that Africa has been lagging. And of course, when commodity prices fall, what we often see is many African countries fall into either some type of recession or slowdown in growth and all of that. But perhaps the GCC countries, have some buffers that can at least limit some of the shocks that comes from commodity price movement. So you also see difference in labor market structure. GCC have larger shares of foreign workers that come in, and majority of these workers also come from Africa and even some from other parts of the world, and they take up some different types of jobs, from menial jobs to different working in different sectors and all of that. And some of these also, Africans also, send in remittances, back home, and which is also very important, and also the depth of the private sector is also diverse across the region, and also some of the legal and political systems, vary. This basically just highlights some of the projects that have happened, recent engagement between Africa and the GCC. We've seen so many GCC countries, particularly coming into Africa since the 90s or even the 2000s, particularly mainly from Saudi Arabia and the UAE. We've also seen investment from companies, in Qatar. Building ports, railways, petrochemical plants, and so many other areas. Saudi Arabia, for instance, leasing land, to be able to address some food security situation back in the GCC. And of course, Africa is very, very diverse as far as agriculture is concerned. But this hasn't been one way. We've also seen a few African countries moving to the GCC. Some are planning to expand their base, particularly in the area of agriculture, providing, like FarmCrowdy, for instance, is providing a digital platform that would connect, farmers and buyers in the UAE. FarmForte is also planning to establish a food processing facility. Mediclinic is also South African healthcare, which has been operating in the UAE since 2007. So there are a list of so many other engagement that has happened between both regions. Now, I think this is also something important, that has been on the pipeline and, has come into fruition last year, which is the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, which is basically to promote one single Africa, in the sense that African countries have all come together except Eritrea to sign on this agreement, which basically means that we will have one market. And of course, Africa, we have 1.3 billion people. We're looking at a $2.7 trillion economy. Some will estimate that it's even over $3 trillion, which tells you that, this is lots of opportunity. We have a case where GDP is going to improve in the next couple of years. Investments are coming in from different partners, so which tells you Africa is, the continent that is, the potentials are just so huge. So the AfCFTA basically promises to lay sort of like a foundation for the establishment of a continental customs union, which will happen much later as we progress into the deal. So basically, tariff on 90% of tariff lines will be eliminated over a 5-year period, and then subsequently 7% will be removed. And what that basically means is, once a good services is produced within Africa, it's eligible for that tariff reduction. At the moment, several countries, African countries, are still preparing some of the relevant instruments to be able to, determine which goods will be exempted from tariff and all of that. And I think Of course, trade and non-trade barriers have been one significant limitation to the expansion of African continent. And this deal basically hopes and promises to address some of those concerns. Now, in terms of some of the opportunities, I think basically it's huge for businesses in terms of having access to different markets within the continent, and not just to trade goods within continent, but also the AFCFTA and some of the secretariat and even some of the countries involved are also trying to see how this can perhaps be used as a vehicle to improve even exports, outside of Africa. But more importantly, intra-African trade is about, one of the lowest when you look at other regions. It's at 16%, which is quite low. And the hope and the promise, and the goal of the AFCFTA is to improve this trade, over time and ensure that Africa, trades within itself and also even exports, to outside the continent, and not just export of primary produce, export of manufactured goods, and services. So what this entails is also free flow of goods, across goods and services across the border, and of course this will enhance, competition, which is needed for innovation, and of course will encourage mobility. On the government side, it is an opportunity for government to boost the inflow of FDI, and I think this is also where the GCC countries come in terms of the fact that they have enormous capital that can be invested in different areas within the continent. There's also opportunities to implement reforms like infrastructure, power, to link cities and countries together and ensure that trade happens seamlessly. Also, it is one big step to industrialization and to improve trade, accelerate adoption of digital technology. A lot of discussions has been going on, particularly with regards to the payments, payment system, for that will facilitate trade, under the AFCFTA. It's been launched recently, and the potential are quite huge. So also the end goal is to boost income and employment and also reduce poverty and also to create a one Africa. Now, in terms of going forward, in terms of the relations between the GCC and African countries, I think this is also very important that we pay attention to issues relating to mutual benefits and mutual respect, between both countries, because the idea, over the years has been that Africa is, of course, a blessed and resourced continent, but partners, there's always the sentiment that Africa wants to be milked of its resources, and I think so Africa, that needs to change in the sense that there has to be some sort of mutual benefits, gains locally, in terms of doing business in Africa, in terms of trade with Africa and all of that. So I'm talking here about things like knowledge transfer, sharing, knowledge sharing, investment in key growth sectors, FDI inflows, and all of that, and also treating some of the citizens with with respect and upholding relevant trade deals and bilateral agreements. Agreements should also be based on unity and trust. Unity within each regional bloc is also very important, and I can point to some of the issues, within the GCC with Qatar and some of the other countries that to a large extent affected, how some of these countries are perceived within Africa, because one party would go and try to block the other party from, engage Africans from engaging with the other party. And I think that, needs to be addressed. And the AFCFTA tries as much as possible to present Africa as, one continent, even though, of course, there will still be, very much challenges, especially at this early stages. Also limited political interference and assistance when needed. I think this is also important, going forward. Now, in terms of, I'm almost at the end of the presentation, in terms of the areas of opportunities in Africa. I think this has been, talked about, the fact that, Africa is endowed in terms of mineral resources. We're talking about gold, platinum, uranium, over 80% of the world's platinum reserves, and more than half of the world's cobalt and diamond reserves are located in Africa. Infrastructure deficit is huge, which is also a challenge, but is also an opportunity because we've seen many African countries moving towards PPPs and trying to attract private investment into infrastructure development. Telecoms has been one of the key sectors, leading sectors, driving growth within the continent. But again, there's still large gap between urban and rural connectivity, and this also presents a lot of opportunities. And we've seen, some of the GCC companies, come into Africa and play a very important role in the area. We have Etisalat in Nigeria, which is one of the biggest telecoms provider. Tourism is also, very huge, and on both sides, there are enormous tourist attractions. You have beautiful cities, beautiful experiences, wildlife, waterfalls, and all of that. And more importantly, also is the food and culture aspect, which I think, it's very important. Also, in terms of manufacturing, there's been lots of talk about diversification, reducing reliance on commodities, and also, producing goods within the continent. And if you look at Africa's import bills, much of what Africa imports are basically manufactured goods, which basically tells you that there's opportunity for local production. And some of these companies have set up, countries have set up, special economic zones, processing zones that I think the GCC countries can also take advantage of. Sports and development and entertainment. I'm glad that Mohammed also mentioned that Africa has a large youthful population, and we love sports in Africa. I've seen lots of GCC investors, invest in the Premier League and all of that. And I think there's a huge opportunity as far as entertainment is concerned, and sports development. And lastly, on renewable energy, which, has been emphasized by His Excellency, Dr. Omar.
Wilson, just for the sake of time, if you can wrap it up in a minute, please.
Okay, yeah. So in terms of the digital revolution, the digital sector has been quite huge within Africa, and it's one of the areas of opportunities that I think GCC countries have been participating in and can even do more. We have lots of startups that are beginning to, connect, provide fintech solutions, agriculture technology solutions, healthcare technology solutions. And I think this is also a key area. And lastly, I think I've touched on this, the fact that investment in manufacturing is important. The service sector is rising. We need lots of embassies and commercial attachés, between both countries. And also we need to organize more trade and events. Excellency talked about the Dubai conference. I think a lot of all of those opportunities can happen, on both sides. Lastly, I'll just end by saying, yes, we understand that there are huge risks in doing business, particularly issues relating to political instability across several African countries, infrastructure deficit, and all of that. But working with partners locally and also working with some of the African countries, I think the opportunities abound. And of course, it would be great to see lots of established partnerships between both regions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wilson. Thank you. And so it's great to listen to you, and there are a lot of points to cover, but just for the sake of time, we go straight into questions. And maybe this question is for His Excellency, Dr. Omar. You've seen the trade and the investment relationships grow over the last few years, but there is a fierce competition between all the different powers. I mean, we've seen China targeting Africa, the US, European countries, especially France, for the French kind of speaking side of the continent. What do the GCC countries have to do to grow their presence in Africa? You're on mute, Doctor. Perfect.
Yes, GCC countries has worked together in certain cases to support Africa, and they realize that working together will bring benefit to everyone. So I think within the GCC there is a thought that yes, Africa is a good market. Yes, Africa is a market that a perfect market we would choose. However, in the long term, actually, there is an opinion that they have to work together and have a strategy that meets one Africa. So one GCC can talk with one Africa. So this kind of dialogue will bring them together. But is there an effort towards getting there together? Yes, but this is being, developed actually. And I think in the medium term, we will see something like that, which I think work for everybody, will work for both the African continent and GCC states.
Okay. Maybe the same question to you, Wilson, with another added flavor. So not only what the GCC countries need to do, but in terms of sectors, I mean, Africa has so many opportunities across all the sectors, as you put in your presentation. But what are the 2 or 3 top sectors that the GCC need to focus on to get to increase their presence in Africa?
Well, I think clearly manufacturing is one sector with very huge potential and opportunity. And like I mentioned earlier, if you look at the import structure of African countries, manufacturing is up there. And what import basically means is that the demand exists locally. So it's how to meet that demand, that is the challenge within Africa. But also the services sector is one that, the growth has been, enormous in the last few years. I think that's one key area. Within manufacturing, you also have petrochemicals, for instance, which is one area that the GCC has lots of expertise, the energy sector, and all of that. So I think those are key areas that that are priority for African countries, and also that have GCC countries also have expertise in those areas. So I think finding a connection is also very important. And also to the question as to how, I think one of the key things, that other partners, regional partners have done, is to come together and, set up some of these trade deals. Just recently, the EU, launched a $150 billion deal or something with African countries and all of that. So coming together, I think, is also very important in boosting relations between both regions.
Very good. I think just the other side of the coin for this question is, what do the African countries need to do? Because Wilson, you talked about the One Africa. I see that taken many years to materialize. African countries, except few kind of outliers here and there, have issues with governance, with lack of infrastructure, with you name it. I mean, so we've seen a lot of the investments that have been happening focused on export, so to mitigate those risks. But what does Africa, or what do the African countries have to do to address the concerns of investors, including the GCC investors? You start this one, Wilson, please.
Yes, I think that has been one of the greatest challenges doing business in the continent, but across several countries. So you see the governments trying to put some of these measures in place, having even some addressing some of the regulatory lapses. Some countries have adopted, PPP model in terms of financing infrastructure. We see the recent, partnership between DP World and Senegal, which is basically building the Dakar port. I mean, that's a huge investment of over $1 billion. And we see much of that type of investment happening, which tells you that many African countries, are very interested in addressing some of these local doing business challenge. In Nigeria, for instance, we have a presidential ease of doing business committee that tends to address any issues relating to doing business within the country. And we've seen lots of progress in the last couple of years, as the fact that Nigeria rose in its ease of doing business ranking. The challenges still remain, still persist, but I think they won't be solved overnight. So it takes a lot of engagement with the businesses and the government and even other stakeholders. That's also one of the things we do at the NESG, is to engage and intervene when there are issues and advocate for much better environment. So we have some of these also happening within the continent.
Dr. Omar?
Africa, there are good examples actually for in Africa who have made a good effort in this respect, and they can be considered a good model, like Rwanda, for example, and reforming their economy and understanding the needs of the investors, and other countries like South Africa, and so there is a clear understanding of such kind of needs. So and we need to look into helping also the African in this respect. There is a lot of effort from both sides, actually. I'm talking here about GCC in particular, and how we can help, Africa, and area of training, education, and also exchange. Having a normal, effective communication between the both, the business sector here, community in UAE or in GCC, and Africa. So those kind of communication will help in making things clear, and also understanding the needs of both parties and the priorities of each and every partner. So I think this is effort coming from both sides, and Africa will, as a good market, will need actually to learn from, for example, from Dubai, for example. Dubai has been a very good, school for many countries, and I think now we see every year there's a business forum coming from Africa. And I think from there we can exchange a lot of experiences and getting together, working together, and an area that of priorities for both parties. So this will help actually, and keep things moving forward in more, rewarding basis.
Very good. Thank you very much, Dr. Omar. Time goes by very quickly when you're having fun. Just one final thought from each of you in a minute, and then we let Moza close the event. But 1 minute, Wilson.
Yes, I can borrow what you said just before the lecture. Africa is the future, and no doubt Africa is the future. Africa is the resources. Africa is the people. Only they need the support. So the earliest, the better to be there. So that's my only point, actually.
Yeah, I'll just say, Africa is rising again. I mean, the opportunities are enormous. So many sectors, that needs to be developed. Services, some have said services is the new oil. And I think manufacturing is also has numerous opportunities that can transform the continent. And the AFCFTA is at the center of all of these. And I think, GCC countries need to leverage on that, to strengthen partnerships between both regions.
Very good. And with both, thank you very much. I really appreciate the closing on a positive note. And I think Africa is the future. If the African countries can get their act together, it's definitely the future. And there will be a lot of competition to get African countries' attention. So again, thank you very much for attending. I want to thank all our viewers. And Musa will take it over to close this event. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mohammed Hamdawi. On behalf of Trans team, I would like to thank the speakers, Dr. Mohammed Omar and Mr. Wilson, for participating in today's lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a good one.
Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you, Wilson. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.